Chicago. I was born here, so it's nice to be back. Thank you all for coming out on such a beautiful, warm Chicago afternoon. I just want to personally mark 30 years. I remember when the idea of the Chicago Humanities Festival was being cooked up by my dad. And a group of other amazing individuals who had a vision for what it would mean to talk and think in hard and complex ways about things that mattered. And so here we are doing that. Looking at the program, that's been going on all day, every day in this festival. So thank you for being here for that conversation. So let me just ask you to join me in thanking those who had the vision for this festival. But also those who are now leading the festival all these 30 years later. It's really wonderful. So this is my second time speaking at the Chicago Humanities Festival. I was thrilled when you all invited me, and I'm thrilled to be here back in my hometown talking about the relationship of emancipation to freedom. So I want to invite all of us, since the theme for today's, or this year's festival is power, I want to invite all of us to bring that concept of power to bear on two fundamental questions, at least for the next hour. What would it mean, first of all, for formerly enslaved people to be truly free? And what role should power, the empowerment of those people, have played in their actual lived freedom? Second question is, what role could or should have reparations played in that larger project of enabling and making possible a robust form of Black freedom? So power relates, I think, to those two fundamental questions. The sociologist Orlando Patterson taught us many years ago that slavery was a form of social death, that its horrendous, life-crushing qualities amounted to the destruction of any real possible social or cultural life for enslaved people. I think the question that Patterson's formulation of slavery also suggests is, what kind of social life was inaugurated as the institution of slavery was abolished? Not just with the 13th Amendment, not just with the Emancipation Proclamation, but even earlier, 1861, when Northern troops moved through a number of communities in the South, and by their very presence, by their occupation of the South and those communities, emancipated enslaved people. So what kind of social life lie on the other side of that emancipation? What was possible then? And I would ask, what's possible now? Related to this question, and again, I'll ask you to think hard about hard things with me, is there any necessary relationship between emancipation of a people and rendering them free? And unfortunately, what my book, Repair, sets out to show is that there is not. That you can emancipate a people from enslavement without rendering them free. And that is the legacy that we continue to live with today. The structural, intergenerational, second-class, second-caste status of Black people in this country. We can repair it, I think, but we have to do so in ways that will be uncomfortable, particularly for most of you in the room here, white people. So I'm very aware as a white person writing and thinking about this that I have a responsibility to own, to be aware of the kind of power that white supremacy delivers to me, and the kind of injuring and enduring badge of inferiority that Black people in this country carry as a weight, as a cross. And reparations, I believe, is part of that pivot between us surrendering some power in order to make black people more free. So let me bring them in the room. This is a group of enslaved people on a plantation in Port Royal, South Carolina, in the Sea Islands of South Carolina. If any of you have been there, I'm sure some of you have, it's a heartbreakingly beautiful place, extremely beautiful place. It was then too, although their lives were certainly not beautiful. Their primary job was raising cotton under enormously violent circumstances. That's what slavery was. And as you can see from this picture, and it's important for me to have them in the room as we talk about what it is to be free and what it is to end the institution of slavery, what you can see here is that this is a complicated family, really, a complicated kinship group of people who live together in large groups, not just in nuclear families as we think of the family in many circumstances today, but because of what slavery, how it structured enslaved people's lives, there were often several heads of a household. The children of others were being raised by friends and extended family because the parents had been sold away. So there was a sense of responsibility to a larger social group than just your blood relatives. And these people all called themselves a family. Right? They all lived together on this plantation in the Sea Islands. So this is what it looked like in June of 1861 when they were enslaved. This is a similar group in July of 1861. What is the difference between this group and this group? These people are freed. They have been freed by the very presence of a white man standing in the front in the military uniform. These people are enslaved by virtue of the troops from the north not having arrived yet. So this is several days after the northern military arrived in the Sea Islands, occupied it, took possession of it, and as they entered the Port Royal Bay, the white slave owners, the enslavers, fled to the mainland, urging many of their what they called servants, but enslaved people, to come with them. And the enslaved people, you can see there's some pretty tough, powerful people in this picture. They're like, I don't think so. I don't think so. We're going to stay here. This is our home. This has been our home for our parents and our grandparents. We know this place, and we'll exchange one white man for another white man. We're going to see how we can work it out here. And so they were charged by their fleeing owners to keep an eye on things while they were away. The assumption was they wouldn't be gone long, that the owners would come back, and then the operations on the plantations would continue as they had before. But what these folks did, in many cases, is that they broke into the plantation mansions, into the owners' homes, and clothed themselves with much of the clothing that had been left behind, and played pool, smoked cigars, had a moment of feeling, not feeling the violent gaze of enslavement. But what I most importantly want to point out about this picture is that the power of what it means to be white and free, like this military official is, means that that is something by virtue of just standing there, you can confer on 15,000 enslaved people. There were 15,000 black people who were enslaved in the Sea Islands in 1861. And by virtue of his just standing there, they were all instantly rendered freed. It's an amazing kind of power to be able to have by your physical presence. At least in a social and in a quasi-legal sense, these people were at that point freed, not free. So what happened next? And we could tell a story that would be one that would take us to a different future and a different world in which we live now. But let me tell you what actually happened. The northern military was very concerned about financing the war. They were having trouble both raising troops but also raising funds to finance the war, and they were thrilled, Washington and Lincoln were thrilled, to be able to capture these plantations in the Sea Islands because they could keep them running selling what was a very, very high-quality form of cotton that they could then sell to the Europeans to finance the war. The now freed people looked at gentlemen like this gentleman here and said, "Are you nuts? We're going to plant corn, we're going to plant wheat, we're going to plant things we can eat. We're free now. We don't have to listen to you." Right? But the military would have none of that, and they were put back to work, running the plantations in ways that looked not that dissimilar from what it was like to be enslaved, although to the credit of that change in regime, it was a much less violent, far less violent experience of working, with the promise of a wage that would come later from the federal government to pay for this work, so that it was not enslaved labor, it was free labor. So people were allowed small plots to plant crops they could eat, but by and large, their major work continued to be growing cotton, a cash crop, which came as no benefit to them, the people living there. But what we see shortly thereafter as more northern military appear in the Sea Islands, and what they understand that they are now up to, the northern military, is a humanitarian project as much as a military project, where these 10 to 15,000 freed people are really refugees from enslavement. We didn't have that term in the 19th century, but by today's lights, we would call them refugees from slavery. Right? And so the US military, the federal military, was responsible for their well-being. And they sat down and they listened. In small groups, in larger groups, in churches, in the fields, outside people's homes, the northern military officers listened to the freed people. What is it you want? What does freedom mean to you? Rufus Saxton was the general that was charged with managing this humanitarian project. He was deeply, deeply moved by what he was hearing. And it was abundantly clear to him that something more than mere emancipation was owed to formerly enslaved people. Part of that was a recognition of the backward-looking horror. Human right, we would call it today a human rights violation of the highest order. But the horror of the torture, the rape, the death, the family separation, the humiliation, the being treated as chattel, as things rather than people, required some kind of reparation, some kind of repair. Certainly also the stolen labor. Certainly the stolen labor, but that was the least of it. Right? It was all of the other things that being enslaved entails as well, particularly in the United States. But so too, to Saxton's credit, and this also is largely due to his talking and listening to formerly enslaved people, he understood that some form of reparation, some material benefit had to be provided to formerly enslaved people in order for them to be truly free. Not just freed, but actually free. That to emancipate a group of people into a state of abject poverty and illiteracy would make it so that they would never be freed. Right? They may not be formally enslaved, but they wouldn't have the material resources in order to build free lives. And so what Saxton and others did is they started to allocate land. As he said, there was a kind of foreclosed mortgage on this land, the land that the plantation, the slave owners had left. They started to allocate that land, sometimes in 40-acre lots, and we know that term today, of course, but sometimes in somewhat smaller lots, to the black people of this community, with the specific intention that they would live there without white people having the right to set foot anywhere in this space. The idea was you or we, the formerly enslaved, the black people said, we need to heal without you here. We need to figure out what our future looks like, and we can only do that together, right? Just leave us alone. We just need the land and then go away, right? And so Congress actually passed an act in 1862, a tax bill in which they assessed a tax on land owned by Confederates. And if you didn't pay the tax, which of course no Confederate would do, they were not going to pay it to the federal government, your land could be seized, formally and legally seized, and that was all of that land that then the military redistributed to the communities in the Sea Islands. And so they began to plant corn. They began to plant wheat. They began to build new lives. And much of what I did in researching the book was spend hours and hours in archives in Washington, D.C. at the National Archive, but also in archives in North Carolina, in Mississippi, and in a range of other places. These are the original deeds of that land to these communities of freed people in the Sea Islands. And I just want you to just take a moment with this document. The X mark, as you see going down the middle, it was a crime. It was actually a felony to teach a black person how to read or write in South Carolina in the antebellum period. So of course people did not know how to write their names, but they did know how to make an X. These X's were the first acts of freedom that they undertook. And to open up these documents in the archives, as I have over the last number of years, many, many times I'm the first person opening them since they were folded up and put in the archives. The paper would sort of crack. Sometimes a hair would fall out. Little evidences of a life. You can also see, this is an enlarged version of it, smudges of ink from when they're signing with a quivering hand, nervous about what this means, excited, but I can only imagine how also disorienting the whole thing must have been too, to be told you are now free. Right? And so sometimes you'd find the ink from the palm of the hand or the thumb, the evidence of these acts of freedom. Right? As they laid claim and were given deeds by the federal government to that land. What they would also do in many cases is go out and make little maps of the land to which they were laying claim. So we'll go from this stream to that tree, to this bog, over to that house. And they would draw a little map, and then in groups, they would lay claim because they were going to live collectively on this land in a very different way than today. We think about individuals having an interest in their own little piece, their private property, their homestead. These were collective homesteads. So very different idea of community and of land ownership and farming. And what I would like to point out is you notice here, men and women alike were given the power to own the land, to get deeds to the land. It wasn't just men, which in the 19th century, white women could not own land. It wasn't until later that the Married Women's Property Acts changed that. So a white woman could not legally own this land, but black women were. Quite something, I think. And again, you see the smudges and the names being crossed off, and there's the burying ground on the bottom and the cutoff creek on the top. And you can imagine how important it was for them to be able to capture the burying grounds as their own land because their parents, their grandparents were there. Right. So this is the Pleasant Point Plantation you can see there that still exists today on Ladies Island. So what happens? If we know our history, this land is distributed to the communities of color. General Sherman also does the same thing with a special order number 15, in which he allocates a year and a half later land to formerly enslaved people in a long swath along the eastern seaboard in 40-acre units and a mule, and that's where we get that term, 40 acres and a mule. It's from Sherman's Special Order 15. So land as a form of reparation is being undertaken here in the Sea Islands, and then another part of the book talks about Davis Bend, which is right outside of Vicksburg, Mississippi. Jefferson Davis's name may be a familiar one to you. He was the president of the Confederacy. He and his brother Joseph had a plantation just outside of Vicksburg, and there too that land was seized. And a utopian black community of freed people was created at Davis Bend. in ways similar to the Sea Islands. And these are two really unique experiments actually during the Civil War and before it's over, where there's an affirmative decision made that we need to give people actual resources to be free, not just freed, but free. 1865 in April, you might remember what happened that month. Abraham Lincoln is assassinated. May of 1865. Andrew Johnson becomes president, besides the fact that he was impeached, which has gained a fair amount of attention of late, but it's not particularly relevant to this story. Andrew Johnson becomes president. His first act in office is to grant amnesty to the former Confederates who seceded from the Union, asking them to sign the ironclad oath of fidelity to the United States government, to a reunited government, and promising them in return the return of all of their land except slaves. That's actually the language of the ironclad oath. All of this land is violently taken away from formerly enslaved people. The communities that they've begun to build, the crops that they've put in, they're just the beginning of what it might be to be free is extinguished with the assassination of Lincoln and Johnson's presidency. And so the former planters return, the former slave owners return, not all of them, some of them have settled elsewhere. Those who did not return were actually paid, reimbursed by the federal government with tax dollars for the land that had been seized through the Tax Act in 1862. They were paid for their land. The freed people who got land were never paid. And some of them, through tax auctions, actually bought the land. So had put money out, that money was never reimbursed to them. These deeds were deemed to be unenforceable, just torn up. Metaphorically, thankfully, they still exist so we can see them, right? But they were deemed to be unenforceable deeds. And the next thing that happened is that all of the freed people who lived in the Sea Islands and in Davis Bend were forced by the federal government to enter into one-year labor contracts with the people who had owned them before. That's what it meant to be freed and not free. That's how we've charted a history that has rendered formerly enslaved people and their descendants into a kind of locked into a form of peasantry, subordinate to the interests of white people in the name of emancipation. Right? And so when I asked you early on this afternoon, is there a necessary relationship between being emancipated and being free? This story tells us that one cannot be a slave and one can still not be free. The whole civil status of being free is something that white people have in a way that's quite different from the kind of being freed and not enslaved that I think that certainly people at the end of the Civil War, black people at the end of the Civil War suffered. But we could have done it differently. We could have done it differently than what we see happened here. We were charting a course to do it differently. So this is the Pleasant Point Plantation in 1863, a little bit later deed than the ones that we looked at earlier. This is the Pleasant Point Plantation today. It's a lovely place. It's a gated community on Ladies Island. They have this really nifty website that you can go on, and it's got a photo gallery, and it's got their history. Well, if you look at their history, they've got deer, waterfowl, rabbits, river otters, alligators, all sorts of good stuff. And down at the bottom, the mention of who founded the Pleasant Point Plantation, no mention of the institution of slavery, no mention of the hundreds of people who were enslaved in this space, no mention of those deeds that those people were given by the federal government, backed up by the word of Northern military officials that this land is now yours, no mention of the land being stolen from them. This is their Christmas party last year. right? I mean, these are nice people. They've got their little red sweater vests. I've got on a little sweater vest. But this, to me, is a testament to white innocence, right? We're not morally responsible for what we don't know about. And we take both affirmative and not so affirmative steps. We're kind of passive in that not knowing. This is why we need to know this history. It's a kind of distant mirror, if you will, to borrow a term from Barbara Tuchman. It reflects back on us today. This history is still us, and it is a usable history of what it could mean to think about the difference between being freed and being free, and why reparations today remain a pressing issue in this society. Recent data demonstrates how that intergenerational accrual of wealth in white families, as opposed to the intergenerational incapacity to accrue wealth in black families, is baked in to this post-Civil War period to today. So 1 in 7 white families are now millionaires. For black families, it's 1 in 50. This is actually from several years ago. It's worse now. Here we have other data. I mean, the data, racialized data on where wealth is housed within white and black families is striking. It's just striking. And then one last slide on medium net worth. We are right now in the midst of the largest intergenerational transfer of wealth we have ever seen on this planet. My generation is in the midst of inheriting enormous amounts of money from our parents as they pass. Much of that money is money that is accrued in white families through the holding of real estate over time. We've also seen the largest increase in the value of real estate in this period of the generation ahead of me. Why does my generation have an entitlement to that lottery? So what I suggest in the book is that we increase the estate tax considerably. And we put a good chunk of what we capture. The estate tax is very low now. One of my estate lawyers is here nodding in the front, right? We could raise the estate tax. People could still inherit a lot of wealth, but not the obscene amounts that the taxes now allow. We could put that into a trust for reparations. And then, as I talk about in the book, fund community land trusts, fund collective housing projects today, programs today that largely benefit communities of color in order to stop gentrification in a range of cities, or in places like Jackson, Mississippi, or Detroit, Michigan, or a number of places like that, where cities are dying. And there are actually vast sections of the city that are withering. That land could be captured, and then community land trusts funded there to rebuild and empower the black community. Not just enrich individual black people, but re-enrich the black community through investing in housing. Now, I don't think reparations should only be that, but that's one thing we could do. Knowing this history, I think, is part of a conversation about reparations as well. Let me stop there and take your questions. Thank you. One more slide. Here we go. All right, that's good to end for questions.
All right, everyone. Myself and my colleague Kevin will be passing around mics. Just raise your hand. You can ask a question, hand the mic back to us. Just 3 quick things. Be sure to speak into the mic. Try to be brief so we can get to as many people as possible. And be sure to phrase your question as a question. So, who has a question here? I'll come around.
Thank you for your talk.
Thank you for being here.
You started off talking about the social life, and I'm curious as to, beyond the reparation of property or granting of property in the community, your ideas on how that social life could be reinvented or reconnected with.
Well, I don't think we could recreate. We can't turn the clock back, right, to what it would be to have exclusive black communities, although we have sort of done that with the way that we have segregated so much of the spaces in which we live. But to do it affirmatively and consciously and thoughtfully is a very different thing than doing it through discrimination. But what I'm seeing in places like Jackson, where there's a group called Cooperation Jackson, is that they've been awarded land for like $1, parts of downtown Jackson, where they are building not just community land trusts where people will live collectively, but also urban farms. They're putting in solar panels, wind turbines, and building a community that is energy independent. And so they're building power and independence in the community as a way of healing. Of course, they also have schools, and they're training their younger people to be healthcare providers. And so they're affirmatively looking to each other to heal and to create community. And this would be an intergenerational project, I think, to heal the wounds of even the things that are happening right now, let alone the ways in which we passed that the wounds of white supremacy through so many generations. So I leave it to the communities themselves to decide how they would want to heal, but there's some really interesting experiments. I was talking about the book in Baltimore a few weeks ago, and what they're doing there is very different from what they're doing in Jackson. But they're large neighborhoods that are kind of abandoned, and they're seizing these buildings. And then in Denver, where they're laying out, Denver's exploding in population. They're laying out new light rail lines. And so there are these land banking programs where these community trusts are buying land along the ways where these new forms of public transportation will be built and sitting on it, so that will be insulated from the kind of real estate boom that will happen that always follows where public transportation is charted. And so they're wonderful experiments, and I would urge you to read the book and find out more about them.
I have a question about how to respond to people who say, I didn't have anything to do with that. Why should I have to suffer or pay reparations now?
Right, no one in my family owned slaves. My family came to the United States well after that period was over. That said, I have been a beneficiary of white supremacy in countless ways. I get pulled over by the police. I get asked the innocent questions and told, please don't speed next time, right? I have advantages in my work. I'm here talking to you. There are all sorts of ways in which I have benefits that come with racial privilege that I think are part of the structure that made slavery possible to begin with. So if we are only focusing on the institution of slavery, then we're asking, I think, too narrow of a question. Instead, I think slavery becomes one of the most brutal forms of white supremacy, but white supremacy is something that has structured US society from the very beginning. That said, our economy, today's economy, the US economy, was built on the slave trade. Right? So to the extent that you live a comfortable life today, and that many of us are living comfortable lives, is in part because of that history. So while you may not, your family or my family may not have actually enslaved anyone, we can't distance ourselves from the problem of white supremacy and the horror of slavery as part of our national inheritance and part of the structure of the economy and our culture. I thought Ta-Nehisi Coates had a great answer to Mitch McConnell. When Mitch McConnell said, it's in the past, right? Like, let's get over it. Well, you can't pick and choose which parts of our history we want to love and celebrate. We celebrate July 4th every July, or the independence of the United States. We celebrate all sorts of things that we want to embrace, but there's some ugly things too that we have to see as part of who we are and part of the DNA of the United States, and slavery is one of them.
It is wonderful to see that you have gone that far, and then that's wonderful to see. We also know that education is at the base of removal of slavery, whether mentally or physically. What do you think is the responsibility of the government and higher institution to actually allow African American and people of color to get education at a price that's affordable to them. Because a lot of students are dropping out because they are student loans and then they're completely blocked in life.
Yeah.
What is the situation that could be held back?
Excellent question. Excellent question. And I think there are many people who are talking about rendering our educational system more just and repairing the intergenerational underinvestment in education in Black and brown communities as part of what reparations should include. One of the things I look at in the last chapter of the book is the intergenerational or over time benefit of investing in land as opposed to investing in education. And it turns out that there's a greater benefit financially and in terms of other forms of human thriving with actually owning property than in like subsidizing education for particular individuals of color, let's say. That isn't to say that we shouldn't improve education in this country and make it, repair the case that people get educated in different ways depending on their race and get different educations because of that. And there are really wonderful, there's wonderful thinking going on about perhaps this trust that I'm suggesting that we create, having a block grant to historically Black colleges and universities, right? Reinvest in Black educational institutions, certainly, but also even in elementary and secondary school, improving education across the country. So I think, yes, and it's vitally important.
Thank you so much for your talk.
Raise your, wait, oh, there you are, thank you.
Anyway, yeah, thank you, this is so informative. One of the things I'm wondering is, you give such a beautiful representation of someone after, well, during the period of Reconstruction, offering land, like recognizing that you can be freed but not free, and the land was the place to begin. And I'm wondering, in your recommendations, it seems like, again, sounds great, have trust, have land, have communities, allow people to create those communities in ways that reflect what they value. But how then do we address the sort of broader framework of the ways in which people and systems may not recognize, like how do you break down the power structures in a sense that allowed for the land to be retaken? So even if we create trusts now, like how do you address the sort of the same thing happening again?
Yeah. So another section in the book talks about what we did with Native American people in this country. So at the very time that Black people were saying, freed people said, we want land, that's what will set us free, African Americans were being forced to own land in fee simple, which is a legal term of, straight out good title. Native American people didn't believe in owning land that way, but they were causing all sorts of mischief in the West as we were trying to build railroads. They were getting in the way and roaming around and not staying put. And so the idea that we would civilize, as the term at the time was, Native people by binding them to the land and making them own a homestead. What they wanted was contract. What they wanted were treaties. What Black people wanted at the exact same time, and you can see the same day in Congress, the same people talking about this, what Black people wanted was land, and what they got was contract. They got labor contracts, right? So these different means of these legal, I love teaching this stuff to law students because they think, this stuff's all boring in the first year, but it gets really interesting when you think about it in history. These different legal tools are used with different populations to serve a larger national project. And what happened with Native people, of course, is they were given or forced onto the land and then swindled out of that land later. So I don't have any naive view that if we had gone with this original plan, that there wouldn't be horrible people who had tricked people out of their land, or as we know, for those formerly enslaved people who did get land, and there were many, there should have been many, many more, though many of those Black communities don't exist anymore because of the Klan, because of racial terror driving people out of the South. So I don't want to be Pollyannish about what white supremacy can do in divesting people of their freedom. But we could have done better than what we did. Right? And at each critical step, we have to think about how to protect people's freedom rather than how to render it more vulnerable. And unfortunately, in this society, at every step, we have rendered black freedom more vulnerable rather than more durable.
Ms. Franke, I commend you for your intentions.
Wave your hand.
Oh.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, gotcha.
I commend you for your intentions, but I must be critical of your approach to it. Money will not buy freedom. And so what you're doing by your approach to things is perpetuating the idea that there are minorities, and those minorities are described by skin color or origin of birth. To me, what I suggest is that we should focus on eliminating the idea of calling our neighbors by their skin color or from where they came. And that would be a lot more successful in eliminating discrimination, because we'll have no sense that there are minorities.
Well, there are many people, I think, who hold the view that what we should do as a form of reparations is write checks to individual black people. And I have a friend who says, "Where's my Cadillac?" I'm good with that. I'd love a check. But that to me is just giving money, throwing money at the issue, rather than thinking about how to empower communities themselves, how they can empower themselves. You probably have not read the Movement for Black Lives platform that came out 2 summers ago. And in it, I'll just share with you, is this fundamental idea of divesting from certain institutions that have perpetuated the subordinate status of black people in this country, like prisons, and divesting there, investing in community empowerment. And that's part of what I'm trying to think about in this book, is how might we not just write people checks, but think about how to empower, to come back to our word of the day or of the festival, empower black people, not because of their skin, but because of the history, because of the forms of white power that have been exerted against them, white supremacy, through many, many means from the founding of this country, or from 1619, if we want to go back even further. So I'm not focusing only on race or skin color. I'm trying to tell a historical story about power and freedom, and I don't think we're throwing money at freedom. I think I'm trying to offer a much more complicated way to think about what it is to repair that historical intergenerational injury. But thank you for your thoughts.
I'll just stand up so you can see me.
Thank you, that's kind of you.
There's been a global movement of sorts in this regard. In Oxford, there was a debate on reparations to be paid by the British to the colonies, and there was a debate in Oxford 3 years ago where the students voted 2/3 to 1/3 for reparations for the colonies. So this is a global movement. This has happened in Australia too. So my question is, can we not, at this moment where there is a lot of debate about these and there's a lot of energy in this field, to move us not just for reparations here, but reparations everywhere, so we look at these things in a way so they don't happen again. So the question really is not just what we do for now, but how do we do this for perpetual future, that these things do not happen, whether it's the Aboriginal people or the Maori people in New Zealand or the Native Indians.
Right. Well, every geographic location, state, region of the world has its own horrible historical narrative it should tell about how people have been, whether it's enslaved or otherwise exploited. My worry about having only one conversation, one overarching conversation internationally, is that different things are necessary in different places. So for instance, even just in the United States, for Native people, we should be talking about reparations there as well. Very often I hear slavery referred to as the original sin. Not so much, really. What we did to Native people who lived here when Europeans settled was pretty horrible, and in some ways predates chattel slavery, or the forcible kidnapping and torture of African people in the US and in the Americas. So what reparations would look like for Native people, very different, I think, than what it would look like or should look like for Black people in this country. Largely, Native people want sovereignty, right? They want a whole different kind of approach than I think you see coming out of the groups that are working and have been working for many years on reparations domestically. Last quick thing I would just say about the many interesting things you said is if we grant reparations once and for all, none of this will ever happen again. I'm not sure that if we want to live in a just world, we want to live in a world where we regard each person based on their humanity rather than based on their race, their religion, whatever the reasons are why we exploit people. Reparations may not be the tool to do that. And I think there's some ways in which, now that reparations is popular, and I have to say I started this book 10 years ago before nobody in a big sense was talking about the issue. Lots of smaller groups were, but we didn't have the same kind of national conversation about it as we are now. I lost my train of thought. I'll come back to it. Anyway.
Right.
Yes.
Great.
Yes, thank you. So much of what we hear in the reparations conversation today is asking reparations to do too much, right? We should have a just society, whether or not we have a history of slavery in this country or not, right? There are all sorts of forms of injustice in the United States, but globally, that don't all have to be tethered to colonialism, to forms of violent conquest, to crusades, to religious wars of various kinds, or to slavery. And so I think at some point, there's only so much weight reparations can bear in curing the world. And so we need to have that larger conversation about what it is to treat each other with dignity. A piece of that is reparations, but I don't think that's the whole story. Thank you for helping me remember where my train of thought was going.
So thank you for a very interesting talk. I really enjoyed it. I was unaware of this history of the transition between Lincoln and Johnson and how the... I was unaware of the history of the transition between Lincoln and Johnson. And I'm just wondering if you could explicate the context a little better. Was this a part of a dispute that they had before the transition, where the land was given, and how did it come about that this, the change in administration led to this very deep change in policy?
Well, Lincoln didn't think he would be reelected, and so he brought on a vice presidential candidate who came from the South and who was a slavery sympathizer. Johnson had always supported slavery, and I would commend to you Jill Lepore's piece in the New Yorker last week or whatever it was, where she's talking about the history of impeachment. But she also does a nice backstory of who Andrew Johnson was. And I mean, there were things to impeach him for that were much worse than what we actually impeached him for. So he was always a sympathizer of Southern plantation owners and enslavers. Never signed up for the project of fighting the Civil War to end the institution of slavery. So of course, the first thing he's going to do is help out his buddies in the South through the amnesty oath and by restoring land. So this was not an inconsistency in any way. This was consistent with who he was, and part of why Lincoln chose him on the ticket. Yes.
Yes, I'm wondering, can you tell me a little bit about how you came to this work 10 years ago? And because I have to say that I have also some issues, quite a few issues about the logic behind the book, not having read the book. But I would like to, I would like to
My students say that all the time. I really disagree, but I didn't do the reading, but however, here's... No, but tell me your disagreement.
Can I understand more about how you came to the work?
So I have two books. The first book is called Wedlocked. the perils of marriage equality. And that's where my research started, was as we were moving towards marriage equality for same-sex couples in this country, I was thinking, what if we went back and looked at what newly freed people experienced when they could marry for the first time? Might there be some lessons for today's same-sex marriage movement of what it means to be a freer, a civil subject through the institution of marriage? Because I've always thought marriage was a kind of odd thing to fight for, to invite the state to regulate your most intimate relationships right after they decriminalized us as felons. I thought, maybe we need a break from the state, not invite the state in, but I had a minority view. So I spent lots of time in archives in the South going through marriage licenses, looking at what happened to African American people who could marry for the first time. And it turns out, be careful what you wish for. In a society that still hates you, marriage becomes the vehicle through which black people were, or let's say the racism that underwrote slavery could perpetuate itself through legal means. So what many states did is automatically married formerly enslaved people who were living together as spouses from when they were enslaved to after emancipation. So they automatically married them, which was a good thing because you didn't have to pay a marriage fee, and these were very, very poor people. And it also recognized the integrity and dignity of their relationships, their marriages. What it also meant is that many, many black men were prosecuted for bigamy, fornication, which is sex outside of marriage, and adultery, because they didn't know that there were rules that went along with this institution. So before the end of slavery, we had almost zero prison population. After we ended the institution of slavery, the prisons were instantly populated with black men who were then leased out through the convict leasing system to do the agricultural work that enslaved people had done before and died at much higher rates doing it, because you will work a leased asset to death. You wouldn't do that with something you owned. So marriage played a big role, marriage laws, in populating prisons with black men. That book is for sale outside too, if you want that. I mean, that's just one of the stories. So, and I take this all very seriously, is how, what it meant as I started. What does it mean to be freed? And what must that have been like? And so in reading those records around the marriage, the institution of marriage, I came across all these other records around these experiments in freedom that I thought, well, here's another book of reparations. So that's how I got there.
Okay, so we're not going to solve this today, but I would like to have a conversation, a beginning of a conversation with you, because I run a project called The History Makers, and we document African American lives and have interviewed 3,300 people over a 19-year period. The thing that I would say is that some of the logic, I don't think it's informed from a black perspective. And for that, I think there's a danger in some of the things that I've heard today, but I don't think, I just needed to say that. I'd like to have a longer discussion with you.
Well, I thank you, because I don't profess to have this all figured out. I feel pretty good about the history, but I'm imagining it's the recommendations at the end, perhaps, that you are taking issue with. Okay, then let's talk. I am always learning, and I look forward to learning from you. Yeah.
So I'm sorry, we have time for one more question.
Hi, Donna Woods. I really enjoyed your talk. I enjoyed the detail that you provided me with across this period. I knew some of the facts, but I didn't understand the dynamics behind it. One of the things I just thought I would share to the, kind of to your last comment about how these structures, like what is free? So I worked in mental health in 1980. And in 1979, and for hundreds of years before that, people were in institutions if they were considered crazy. In 1980, people were given a subway token and put out onto the streets. And the same kind of thing what triggered my comment is, same kind of thing, moved right straight from the street into the prisons. You know, and that became the new sort of institution of mental health. So maybe your next project.
Actually, I am working on a history of private prisons, so we'll work together too. Yeah, thank you.